Alright, episode 16 of Apothecary Diaries. The episode is called Lead, and main premise involves this family of craftsmen that are specifically purveyors for the imperial house. Now, we discussed last episode that specifically the purveyor for imperial houses generally will only provide for imperial houses. Usually, the specific kind of product they make for the imperial house, they couldn't sell it to commoners. And overall, they would have been paid very well by comparison to everyone else. And it was also a great testament to their craftsman skill. Therefore, it also acted as a great advertisement. And what we have here is essentially death of a craftsman and subsequent family feud over the inheritance. This is a tale old as time. Even my family, like my dad's generation, didn't have any of this, but my grandfather's siblings were also fighting over inheritance. So this was, to many extent, a problem many families faced. And that was how to divide up inheritance fairly, that nobody felt left out or unfair. Because the family is a craftsman that provides for the imperial house, they're most likely living in a better part of the city. However, generally speaking, craftsmen were considered socially a lower status compared to your scholars and even farmers. So traditionally, the kind of social status goes scholars first, and then farmers, and then craftsmen, and the merchants are at the bottom. However, if you think about it, merchants would have been the richest people, so they would have been rich, but socially lower status. They weren't allowed to take the imperial exam personally if they were merchants themselves. And generally, there were many government policies strongly against merchants in favor of farmers. But nonetheless, a well-crafted craftsman and well-off merchant would have been much richer in terms of possession compared to your average farmer. And the mystery was quite simple. It just involved differential heating in metallic element and melting temperature of lead, which was quite low by comparison to other metals. For the kind of work that we've seen this particular craftsman do, lead would have been very important because based on the kind of stuff we are shown the craftsman family has been making, we'd assume that it's something to do with bronze or copper casting. And the major ingredient in bronze is tin and lead. Therefore, the solution to this mystery was relatively simple, that you magnify and focus the sun ray using a convex lens and focusing it into a point and just melt the lead. However, because of the scarcity of transparent glass back in the day, this wouldn't have been common knowledge to people. The show even made a point about the glass utensil that it used to focus the sunbeam, which is a fishbowl, being quite rare, because after all, common traditional Chinese fish bowls would have been made of porcelain instead. There would be some stone ones, but generally they would have been porcelain bowl. And glass bowl wasn't really a thing until modernity because transparent glass was quite rare. It required really the Industrial Revolution and industrialization to achieve. While Mama was at the artisan's house, we've seen them being served tea in a very traditional teacup that has a lid and a cup holder on the bottom. This is a quite common construction in Chinese teacups. You can find most forms of this in a lot of Chinese tea sets. These would have been the staple form of teacup with a lid and also a cup holder. They also mentioned how the window is designed with a Western style, which is totally true. Chinese windows generally weren't this vertical shape. And if I might add, this is more than just Western style, this is more modern style. Because even traditional Western windows, if they weren't church windows, common house windows didn't look like this as well. Now, when the whole situation was resolved, luckily the family didn't continue the feud over inheritance, which is more than I could say for a lot of families. Most of these cases wouldn't end so peacefully and so calmly That's why a lot of family business generally didn't last too long. More often than not, a family feud over inheritance would be able to tear a whole family business apart. And we've seen this plenty of times. And while they're traveling back into the imperial palace, we are shown with a view of the street in the better part of the town, which, yes, it's pretty accurate in terms of road construction. We have a stone-plastered road for the main road, and then dirt road as sidewalk. And this kind of construction you can still see in a lot of very traditional and less developed older towns in rural China nowadays. After the resolution of the family feud, we're shown with the guy in the monocle once again discussing with Jinshi over the possibility of what this craftsman actually provides to the imperial house. And that's actually ceremonial artifacts. What they mean by ceremonial artifacts is that ancient Chinese society had a lot of ceremonies basically honoring different individuals, whether that be an ancestor of the current dynasty or prominent individuals throughout history. And for every single ceremony for a specific person, they'd have to use a certain kind of ceremonial gear. That includes candle-based incense burner and other kind of utensils. And for each individual, there would have been a different set. Depends on the prominence of the individual, the set of ceremonial artifacts and ceremonial utensils would be different. And these would be kept in a vault, but they needed to be replaced from time to time. Sometimes there need to be repairs done on it, and some of these utensils actually are expendable. You use them enough so that they actually get damaged, and you need to replace them. So that's where the artisan came in. And for Jinshi to actually dabble in this, once again, it first of all showed that he might not just be managing the rear palace, because most of these ceremonial roles would have been relegated to some members of the imperial family. And secondly, this was more of a job for someone who's specifically in charge for ceremonies. And because of the fact that this artisan family is a purveyor of such utensils, which, by the way, most pictures you find of these ceremonial utensils, especially the very old ones, will generally look rusty and greenish, which wasn't the case in the past. Bronze, which usually is the kind of material these utensils would have been made from, they rust. And when they rust, they produce this typical greenish copper rust. But when freshly made, they look almost identical to gold utensils. They're actually golden color. But because of the archaeological value of these artifacts, we generally don't polish it so much it looks brand new. When we find certain objects, we generally keep it as if we've just found it with just minor cleanings. So whichever oxidation and rust on it would have been kept. But in reality, the actual in-use utensil would have looked drastically different. They would have looked golden in color. And speaking of ceremonial utensils, this in particular isn't exclusive to the imperial family. Now, the kind of utensils that are made by specific craftsmen, say, for example, the craftsmen were shown here, they might be restricted. Like, you couldn't buy the same kind of utensils this craftsman makes for the imperial family, but you could still use certain utensils for your own ceremony, for your own ancestors. And usually those would have been a step down. And generally speaking, if the utensils used by imperial family were bronze or gold plated, commoners would really just use porcelain utensils. But nonetheless, they would have been kept specifically for ceremonies, rather than used for everyday purpose. Now we talked about sword hanging in the house last episode. Well, we actually do have an example. Jinshi was shown essentially half naked with a sword in hand in the ending sequence. So clearly that's his sword, and he actually used the sword, rather than this just being a decoration, as we mentioned in the last episode. And since we're potentially getting a trip to the city outside of Imperial Palace next episode, it's worth mentioning a very recent archaeological find in China. That we've actually found examples of water pipes underground in the city ruin somewhere in China pretty recently, showing that for some specific dynasties, ancient Chinese streets might be drained by drain pipes. And somewhere down the line, this kind of tradition was either lost or considered too expensive, so dropped. So that was actually brand new. And for next episode, we are going to the city. We probably will talk about essentially night market and street food in China, in ancient China and in nowadays China, because street food is still a big thing in China nowadays. So that's all for episode 16, and we'll see you guys next episode.